I've given this lecture a couple of times before, and every time I add more things in, and I realize I'm going to have a part 2, 3, 4, and 5. So, what I thought I would do today is to take us from ancient history and go into, well, almost modern times. I will be focusing primarily on European and a little bit of Arabic design. And then once we get to part 2 someday, then we'll look at some beautiful theaters that have extraordinary ceilings as well. So today we'll focus primarily on religious places. Not everything we look at will be a church or a mosque or whatever, but rather to see the growth of the industry of decorating the ceilings. And so a lot of it will have to do with fresco. And with that, let's just dive on in. So oftentimes a ceiling is called the fifth wall, and this has been popular since millennia to decorate ceilings. And so part of the decoration of ceiling process has to do with fresco. And I'm sure that you all have seen a fresco. I know you've all traveled extensively. And that fresco is when you combine plaster with paint, whatever those particular pigments may be. And so, what has to happen because the plaster dries so quickly is that you need to have a cartoon first. And where you see the leaves here, that's the cartoon that someone has figured out. And then to take a little sack of charcoal after the pin pricks have been put into this tissue paper, and then put it up against the plaster while it's wet and get those outlines ready, because you have to work rather quickly with fresco. In other words, the paint is drying into the wall or drying into the ceiling. And as we look at these various frescoes, and we'll also look at various tiles and paints and everything, it's just extraordinary what humans can do in creating these beautiful places for us. So I'm going to go all the way back to the Egyptian first. And what I'll do is I'll show you the building. And then as we go inside, then we'll focus on the ceilings. And as we look at the Temple of Hatshepsut, we'll see some very early work in plaster. And what we are looking at is the heavens above, where you see the blue, and of course the plaster has cracked a little bit. This is thousands of years old, and it's been subject to various weather conditions. Rain, of course, is always one of the worst things to happen to fresco. And here is where the frescoes represent where the rulers who have passed away will start their journey to the afterlife. And then once they go to the afterlife, then they will meet the various gods that we'll see along the decoration of the sides of the temple. So, for example, here is the blue that would represent the heavens, and then these 5 pointed stars, and then various gods. So we'll see the snake god and then the sun disk, because one of the most important gods in Egyptian mythology would be the sun god Ra. And then the snake would represent the snake that we see in the helmets of the pharaohs, representing Wadjet, Wadjet, which would be one of the rulers. There's both Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. So without going into a lot of Egyptology and rather focusing on the paintings, this is where the representation of the walls will be where the rulers will meet their gods. And here's a close-up of the paintings where you can see a little bit behind. Some of the plaster is broken away. And these, of course, can be conservators' nightmares, because we all know what happens with concrete. There starts to be little chips and plaster gets chips. And in this case, it was easy to create this fresco because the painting could just be done right on it. Each one of these 5 pointed stars are a little bit different, but when it comes to the symmetry of all of these snakes, for example, that would have been done with that cartoon so that the snakes or whatever figure that we're looking at would all be in the same shape and the same form. Now, it's interesting that oftentimes the structures were reused in a later date. Of course, we know that cultures change and we know that religions change. And in this case, there was a Coptic monastery that was built between the 6th and the 8th centuries, Common Era, and images of Christ were painted over the original reliefs. And here it's a little bit hard to see, but there is sort of a face figure here, and then sort of a X figure, and then what appears to be a snake figure. It's not completely clear what archaeologists have excavated here, but it's interesting to see how sometimes the older frescoes have been painted over, because one of the issues that happened is that 2 decades after Hatshepsut's death, under the direction of another ruler, Thutmose, references to her rule were erased. And the reasons behind the prescription is a mystery. It's not really sure why references to her were erased, but the damages were then repaired under some later pharaohs. Now, another one of these tombs is the Temple of Nefertari. And because of the paintings inside here, this has been called the Sistine Chapel of Ancient Egypt. And these are beautiful, glorious paintings. Even here, we're seeing the jackal-headed god that would be one of the escorters into the afterlife. His name is Anubis. And then here would be a representation of Nefertari. Many of these places have been sealed off and open only to archaeologists because our breath that has moisture in it causes problems for the frescoes. And every once in a while, they will stabilize the frescoes and then allow the public in, but many of these places have been limited. And then here is an example of that same kind of ceiling that has the stars in the sky, where one might go into the afterlife, and then various depictions of Nefertari, as well as people who were around her, family members, people who had been her servants. Here we see the bowling pin shape of one of the rulers, and then, of course, the hieroglyphics. We weren't able to understand those hieroglyphics until Napoleon and his troops had gone into Egypt in the late 19th century. And then the Rosetta Stone had been discovered that had the hieroglyphics, the Egyptian writing, and then Greek writing, and then some local writing. And they were able to make that understanding of the hieroglyphics because of the ability to read the Greek language. And then soon after its discovery in 1904, the tomb had become a very famous attraction, but unfortunately, with the infiltration of water and salt from the porous limestone, caused the paintings to deteriorate. And so after some very intense restoration from 1988 to 1992, this tomb has been reopened to the public. And then another one of the Egyptian tombs. This one is really quite spectacular. Keep in mind that the exteriors would have been painted after thousands of years of the sand and the weather erasing the polychrome meaning the many colors of paint. What we're looking at, just like when we look at the Greek and Roman temples, we're looking at the stone underneath it. So when we get to the Greek era, of course, I will tell you about the colors in there as well. So this is dedicated to the god Horus, and you might see Horus as an owl shape, the god of kingship and the sky, as well as Hathor, who is a cow-headed goddess. and she's the goddess of the sky. And this is pretty much intact. This gives you a sense of how large these temples are because I showed the individuals walking through here, and various testimonies to the various pharaohs. And then as we look more closely, there are beautiful details in the ceiling. So first of all, the tops of the columns, the capitals, are the pharaoh's faces. And then as we go way up here, we will see the blue and gold painting that is represented here. And this is Nekhbet, Nekhbet. So Nekhbet is the vulture goddess who was the protector of Upper Egypt and especially its rulers. Now, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt are always confusing. Upper Egypt is more in the south, and Lower Egypt is more in the north, and it had to do with the way that the Nile River flowed. And as I mentioned, those serpents, the snakes, are a connection to Wadjet, who was the goddess of Lower Egypt. And then together they represent the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. And here's some more of the details of Nekhbet, the vulture goddess. And then an extraordinary section of the Temple of Edfu is the sky goddess Nut, N-U-T. Now, here is how they explained how the sun rises and then set. The Egyptians viewed the sun as rolling across the sky, and in this mythological story, every evening she swallows the sun. So here's the sun, and she's always depicted with her arms way over her head, looking very uncomfortable. So it seems like these are two arms that are just sticking out of nowhere, but that's the way she is represented. And then it passes through her body, and then every morning she gives birth to that sun again. So at night, she swallows the sun, and in the morning, she gives birth to the sun over and over and over again. Now, there's also symbols of the zodiac that are on the ceiling, because in the time when the Greeks had come into Egypt, and also there's Roman influences as well. So oftentimes a building will include various references to various cultures. Now let's go to the Greeks. Let's look at the Erechtheion. And this was built to house a statue of Athena, and it was also a temple built for an early Athenian king of Athens. His name was Erechtheus, and so this is why this is the Erechtheion, a temple to him. Now over here, the porch has these beautiful maidens. Now, this is all part of the Acropolis, which means holy hill. There are many acropolises. The most famous one, of course, is in Athens, and this is where there would be seats of government, and then you would go to the Parthenon to worship the goddess. And these beautiful figures, who are dressed in what's called wet drapery in carving, in sculpture, where the bodies look as if the drapery is wet as it molds over their bodies. This would be an influence in many fashion periods, not only in the Napoleonic era, where women wore their dresses, and what they would do would be to wet down the cotton that they would wrap themselves in, a very heavy cotton called muslin, and try to replicate the look of these ladies. Of course, it gets a little bit cold in Paris, so that's kind of surprising. And then many of you might remember the empire waisted dresses back about 1965, 66. So that's where it all goes back to, are these lovely maidens. They're called caryatids or caryatids, and they will serve as inspiration in interior design history for a couple thousand years. When we see these figures, they're often used as figures around a fireplace, or sometimes a chair leg, or sometimes in the arms of the chair, or if it's in a chest or a big cabinet, you might see these caryatids that are the inspiration. And because so many cultures, Western cultures, look back to Greece and Rome for inspiration, this is part of why we see these figures. Just as an example, in our own country, back east, all of the post offices look like the Parthenon. And that's because of how we as a young nation were hitching our wagon to the greatness of the Greek and Roman empires. So in the Erechtheion now, we look up to the ceiling and there are coffered ceilings, Coffered. And these coffers are these areas that kind of recede back into space. They can be like boxes that are pulled out. They don't have to be square. They can be a hexagon. They can be an octagon. But not only does it give us a visual, but also when we go inside, we'll find that there's also a sound purpose to this. If you have visited the Pantheon, which we'll look at in just a moment, you'll be familiar with these coffers. And speaking of which, when we go into the Pantheon, the temple to all of the gods, this detail that the Romans had learned from the Greeks, as the Romans had conquered the Greeks and were so admiring of them that they copied a lot of their work, that in the Pantheon, in the interior, we find the same coffers. Now, the Pantheon is a really interesting place. And as we go to the interior, here are the coffers that recede back into space, a classical design with the triangular pediments. And then there is a huge 20-foot oculus at the top. Now, oculus can sometimes mean the eye of God looking at you, especially if it's in a Judeo-Christian concept. Here, because this is a temple to all of the gods, this would be perhaps many of the gods looking down upon you. It is open to the sky, so rain does come in, but in the marble floor, there are many drains that would help to drain the rain off. And I love this particular painting because it looks like there's just a couple of fellows who have climbed up to the top. I don't know how you could do that. It's a rather formidable building. But in any case, you see the blue sky in the background. Here, not only is there the beauty of the concrete that was used to create the Pantheon, but also there's an acoustic aspect about the Pantheon. It's amazing to think about this. There's no machinery at the time. They would have had to use cranes and hoists to make something like this. And they created this in concrete. Surprisingly, the recipe for concrete was lost for the Middle Ages. And then when the Renaissance comes along, individuals who were interested in archaeological digs discovered a variety of libraries and texts and things like that. And that recipe for concrete came back in the early Renaissance. There's also the worries of transporting everything. So in the case of the Pantheon, everything had to come down the Tiber River by boat, including the 16 columns, these large columns that we see here, that had been ordered for the interior. Each one of these columns is 39 feet tall, 5 feet in diameter, and 66 tons in weight. So they were dragged on wooden sledges and then floated by barge and then came across the Mediterranean. So they'd come from Egypt and then put on a trip across the Mediterranean to land these columns in Rome. Here's another view of it as you walk into it. And these various niches have beautiful details in them. Various Roman rulers are depicted in the niches. And then here's looking straight up at the Pantheon. Again, it's just absolutely amazing how these were created with lack of machinery and how they had to bring in all of the materials. Now, let's look at tile. So rather than adding images by using pigments in the frescoes, some artists had created these patterns of shapes by arranging hundreds and thousands of little tiles that either could be ceramic tiles, they could be glazed ceramic tiles, or they could be glass tiles, which is a whole different process that I will explain. So I found this image of a very old tile pattern from a temple in Mesopotamia. Not only is there a zigzag pattern, but there's also a diamond shaped pattern. And of course, we're all familiar with many of the tiles that we'll find in Pompeii and many ancient Greek and Roman temples. Evidently, there was a status symbol to mosaic art because, of course, it takes artists a long time to make this. And how this will be used in an extraordinary way will be in many of the early churches. Now, this is a mausoleum of Galla Placidia in Ravenna, which has a plethora of beautiful ceilings in tile. And she was a convert to Christianity. We're not completely sure if it's actually Galla Placidia who at one time was buried here, but sadly there was a fire inside and the body that was there, now we might be able to figure out the DNA. But in any case, as a way to thank God for saving herself and her children from a terrible storm, she had converted to Christianity. And then on the interior, the artisans had created these beautiful tiles or mosaics, or these tiny little tiles are called tesserae. So that's the Latin term for the little tiles. So whatever you want to call them, mosaics or tiles or whatever. They're not always flat tiles. The artisans discovered that if you set them a little bit off, that will help to capture the light inside many of these rather dark places and then would reflect that light all around. So almost like taking a mirror and flashing it around, but you can imagine how the glint of the light comes into these places once a door is open and just flashes all around. So if you've been here, you know that it's rather dark on the inside, and then the docents will use flashlights to pinpoint various details. Because it is a mausoleum, the windows are not really there. In other words, they are covered by a kind of shale. It's an amber colored shale. Now, how tile is made is to lay out a long section of glass. Of course, that's molten sand and other items that are put in there. And then either once that has what's called annealed, Annealed, which is basically the glass hardening. It anneals. And sometimes gold leaf or silver leaf was put underneath that glass, and or various materials were put in to create the colors. For example, cobalt is put into the annealing process to give you blue. And then magnesium can kind of give you oranges and reds and various other colors for these very bright tiles. And in the interior of the mausoleum of Galla Placidia are these various stories from the Bible. And I will get you very close up to the inset of the tiles in just a moment, just to see how labor intensive this was. Galla Placidia also was the daughter of a Roman emperor, Theodosius the First, so there would have been a lot of money to have created something like this. This is the Byzantine era. So that means the Eastern Roman Empire and its design. And this is Saint Lawrence, and the story of his martyrdom was that he had been roasted upon a fire. And so oftentimes the symbols of their martyrdom are shown along with the saints. And then in this little library, there are the four evangelists, the first four books of the Bible, of the New Testament, I should say, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But we're going to come to another depiction of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in just a moment. And here's an example of how those tiles are set, as well as the various beautiful colors that we see. Here's some tile that would have that gold leaf underneath it, and various materials, as I mentioned, being put in to create these different colors. But of course, you'd have to chop up these pieces of glass. They're not always going to be perfectly square, and that adds to the beauty, I want to say the charm of these mosaics. And then here is an image of Christ as the Good Shepherd. And then the most extraordinary part of the interior of the mausoleum of Galla Placidia is on the ceiling. As you look straight up, there's those beautiful stars of the heavens. And in the corners are the four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And here is Matthew, who's represented by a man or an angel, which the book of Matthew talks about the life of Christ on earth. And then Mark is represented by a lion, who represents St. John the Baptist crying out in the desert, just like a lion would roar. Luke is represented by a bull or an ox, because the book talks about the sacrifice of Christ in the crucifixion. And then here is the book of John, represented by an eagle and the life of Christ in heaven. Another example of one of these Byzantine structures, a basilica, is either a designation given by the Catholic Church to a very important church in church history, or it can be like a crucifix plan. So in other words, that the altar is way up at the front, there's a long nave. The exteriors are very plain, and the reason for this is in early Judeo-Christian architecture. And if you think about the catacombs of the very simple drawings, that our exteriors are not important. It's what's inside that's important. It's the soul that's inside. Notice how plain Galla Placidia mausoleum is, even though the brickwork is beautiful. But even in these early churches, the exterior is plain, but the interior is glorious. That's supposed to represent our insides, our souls, as good people of faith. Now, this was dedicated to a martyr, Vitalis, and Saint Vitalis is the patron saint of Ravenna, where there's a lot of these beautiful structures in Italy. So as we look at the tiles on the interior, you can see there's an image of Christ here. And then there we go. Just absolutely glorious on the inside with the bright colors of the tiles. Right here is a sort of like a vase, and all of these vines come out of it. It actually represents the tree of life. And then we have peacocks in the corners, and the peacocks, the tail feathers, the eyes of the peacocks represent the eyes of God. And then I'll walk you around a little bit more, or let you feast your eyes on this for just a second, even having some geometric forms. And the columns, by the way, since we're looking up at the ceiling, is what's called a basket capital. It's not the Greco-Roman capitals, the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian, but more of an Eastern Holy Roman Empire look about them. And here's looking straight up. This is the Lamb of God. And then all of this foliage, you might hear the term vegetal, not vegetable, but vegetal, but foliage, which of course represents the agriculture and the many gifts that are given to us by God in speaking of religious meanings. And here's a close-up of that Lamb of God with the various angels pushing towards or holding their hands up. This is called an orant position, O-R-A-N-T. And orant is kind of like when you throw your hands up. You might see this in a Pentecostal church of people worshiping by throwing their hands up. And we see that orant position in many of the early churches. And then along the sides, the various disciples. And here is a sacrificial lamb. And then various symbols of the angels holding up this round area with the cross in the center. And this is Jeremiah, one of the prophets. And this is Moses over there. And this is the story of Abraham, who is about to sacrifice his son. And at the very last moment, when the son is about to be sacrificed, just to prove his faithfulness to God, you'll see the hand coming out of an angel, or perhaps the hand of God, saying that you have shown that you have been faithful to me. You don't have to sacrifice your son, but rather a lamb will be sacrificed instead. Now, people did not read at this time. The knowledge that comes along with the invention of the printing press and the expansion of knowledge. So when people visited these churches, they would understand the stories just as they would be repeated in a church service. And this is what the stained glass windows would be about, was to show the stories of the saints and show the stories from the Bible, because people would recognize them visually. Just like when we're learning to read, or if our parents were reading to us, that we would recognize the picture of the cow or the dog or the cat or whatever and start to connect the words with it. So these various stories would be very important to bring to life what the worshipers had heard. In San Vitale, on one of the walls, even though we're focusing on the ceilings, I did want to bring up how these artisans dealt with various issues. And here, as this church was built under Justinian, Emperor Justinian, the bishop was Maximanus. Even his name is listed here. And you can imagine that the artisans have Maximinus in one ear saying, I'm the bishop, I'm more important when you create this visual, and then probably Justinian in the other ear saying, well, I'm the emperor here. So even though we tend to think of the artwork as very simple and not fleshed out the way that the Greeks and the Romans would have fleshed out their sculptures, rather, the artisans in the early Judeo-Christian era didn't want that fleshing out because they had been persecuted by the Romans, so they want to develop their own kind of art. And also, these flattened out bodies, remember that the body's not really important, it's the soul. Even though there's beautiful fabrics here, but notice how Justinian has the probably a baptismal bowl that he's holding over the elbow of Maximinus. However, notice that Maximinus's robes and his feet are in front of the emperor. So these are not unsophisticated artists. They knew what they were doing. The visual is just different from something that we would have seen in Greco-Roman times. And oh, that's a great question. Were the artisans of these ceilings officials of the church or lay people? Lay people. And that's such a great question to open up how these artists were viewed. We're going to be looking at some of the work of Michelangelo, which will explain a little bit of the question, but also throughout the Middle Ages, we don't know who the artisans or the architects or any of the construction people were because your name was not important. You did your work for the glory of God. Now, once the Renaissance comes along and the idea of humanism, of what an individual can accomplish, not instead of what God has meant for you, but in addition. And this, of course, was a consternation to the Catholic Church. But what the individual could accomplish, and in the Italian Renaissance, that's when we start to see the names of the architects and the artists and the sculptors emerge with the idea of humanism. And by the way, everybody, I'm always speaking from an historical point. So if I make a reference to a particular religion, I'm speaking historically. So yeah, we don't know who these amazing artists were that gave us these gorgeous ceilings. So keep that in mind. There's a little bit more to that answer. All right. And then here is his wife, the Empress Theodora, who evidently was kind of a Florodora Theodora at one time, but Justinian married her, and here she is in all of her fabulous pearls and robes and everything. Even though we've said the exterior is important, we're talking about the body, maybe not so much the clothing, as this is quite beautiful. And let's see, do I have a close-up? Ah, here we go. So there's a close-up of the tesserae that have been put in, and also sometimes mother of pearl as well. So here in her crown, there's some mother of pearl. And then in her dress at the bottom, if you see three men walking, those are the three wise men. So including so much importance of the various stories from the Bible. And even here in the shield, that is what's called the Chi-Rho symbol. And actually it's Chi-Rho iota, which is the first three letters of Christ's name in Greek. So it looks like a P and an X, but that's actually a Christian symbol of this shield, or the Christian soldiers. All right. Now let's go to the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. The Quran forbids showing the face in religious context. There's other religions that don't have the face shown in a religious context. And throughout history, we've seen that in Christianity, for example, that the reason for that is that the idea is that only a higher being can create a human, or that a higher being can create something perfect, whomever one might believe in, whether it be God or Allah or whomever. Now, you might see faces in secular contexts, but in terms of religious context, you don't see the face being shown. And in the Islamic religion, they have developed a very elaborate calligraphy system, which of course is the writing, and then also the curls that we'll see, these arabesque. I know that a lot of people know that as a ballet term, but arabesque also means the curls that we'll see in the vines and the lines. So it's, as you know, a site that is sacred to all three religions. And as we go into the interior, we'll find all of these arabesques and calligraphy all around. Now, the foundation stone, let me go back over here for just a moment, is sacred to both Muslims and Jews, is that the Prophet Muhammad has been traditionally believed to have ascended into heaven from this site. And here is where Abraham was said to have prepared the sacrifice of his son Isaac. That same image I showed you of Abraham and Isaac. It's, of course, a place of contention, as we know, but as we're looking at it from an artistic view, note right here is that tree of life. There's a little vase right there, and all of these curls and vines would represent not only the givings that we have from whomever we may believe in, as agriculture brings forth fruit and vegetables, but also the many parts of our lives, the tree of life. Now, the interior is decorated with marble and mosaics and metal plaques. And even though this is quite similar to some of the designs that we might see in the Byzantine buildings, this dome excludes any sort of animal or human forms in it. And here, of course, is the calligraphy. Here's a close-up of one of those vases, if you will, that serves as the tree of life. Now, in this case, this vase is the acanthus leaves that you would see in a Corinthian capital. So, as I often talk about in all of my classes, we're living in this era of being careful of any sort of cultural appropriation. And we know what incorrect cultural appropriation would be, but there's also cultural appreciation. We have been traveling and intermarrying and conquering and moving around since the dawn of time. So here we're actually looking at a Roman design with the acanthus leaf. So I should say a Greco-Roman design. So oftentimes you'll see cultures that are intermixing in the designs that we're looking at. Here's some more of the interiors. I'm sorry about the little watermarks here, but it was the best example I could give you of this one area with these beautiful tiles in it. Notice also that the earth gives forth in the leaves and the trees, the grapes. And of course, the grapes would be important in the Eucharist, taking the Mass. There are various periods that are represented in decorating the interior. There are 45,000 blue and gold tiles on the exterior that were installed during one of the leaders in the 1500s. There are 1,280 square meters of mosaics. And by the way, in the Muslim religion, there is a concept of getting into your design. And as you see how complex these designs are, that for the tile artists or the calligraphers or whomever, it is a way of communing or getting closer to Allah, very similar to whatever feeds our souls, whether it be playing the piano or playing a sport, or for me, it's research. You get into the moment and everything else disappears. And it's a way of connecting with something in your roots. So, in creating these calligraphy panels or creating the tiles, this is a way to get closer to their Allah. Now, the Alhambra Palace, this is a very famous Moorish palace. The Moors were those who came from the north of Africa, of the Islamic faith, across the Strait of Gibraltar and conquered Spain from 711 to 1492. And the Alhambra, that means red in Arabic, which refers to the redness of the bricks in which this fortress was built. Now, the interiors are extraordinary, again, because of the tile work, but the repetition of the tile work as well. So in the Court of the Lions, you can see little lions that are all around the fountain. And as we get closer up to what are called these honeycomb details. Now, that's a more modern word. The concept of the honeycomb is seen even more in the Hall of the Two Sisters. So look around here for just a moment. All of these curls and swirls, which come under the general term of arabesques. And then getting even closer up, oh my gosh, that's absolutely extraordinary that all of this are pieces of tile that are set into the concrete. Here are the sections of tiles that are done in blues and kind of these brown colors. And again, just to think about the work that is being done here is quite mind-boggling. And then also in Shah Mosque, to emphasize the importance of tile in not only Islamic culture, but many cultures, is because these are hot areas. So Spain is hot, Iran can be hot, the Mediterranean. And there was a great confluence of art between these artisans. So, for example, in Spain, and let me just go back here for just a second, under the artisans of this period of, again, 711 to 1492, the artisans would often trade knowledge, especially with the artisans from Italy. And if you look at Venice, Venice has a little bit of a Middle Eastern feel to it, a little bit of a Moorish feel to it. And that's because the artisans in Italy would travel over to Spain by boat and vice versa, and they would exchange ideas. In this time, you have artisans of all three religions who would build these structures. There are synagogues that are built by the artisans of all three religions. There are mosques, there are churches, and they all got along just fine, and they exchanged ideas. So in these hot areas, the tile is especially important because not only can it hold water in fountains, and that would give you a cooling element, but in the Christian religion, that would also have a symbol of baptism, of renewal. So in the Shah Mosque, as one of the great examples of Persian architecture, we have the dome in the front, and then there is a sort of a courtyard in the back in this painting, which gives us a whole view of it. And here's some more of that honeycomb design and the calligraphy all around. Now, two very important colors in Moorish design are blue and yellow. Blue represents the color of the sky and the sea, and yellow represents the sun and the moon. Now, here in California, where we have a very strong Spanish influence, if you look at the tile all around you, if you were to go to a Spanish colonial revival structure, that you will find a predominance of blue and yellow tile, because when the missionaries had come to California, they have seen the visuals throughout their own Spanish history. And we'll find that same color pattern in many Islamic designs. You particularly find it with the Moors, but here, even including some turquoise. And this one is always such a surprise when we see this view of the interior of the mosque. I've been to many of the places that I'm showing you today, so at least I can visually describe them. This one I have not, but here is a wonderful example of that beautiful blue and yellow tile that I was speaking of. This is one of the tallest Gothic cathedrals, Saint Pierre, and this symbolizes the height of construction in the Gothic era. And again, we don't know who created these, but without any sort of equipment, without any sort of electricity, these are master craftsmen who have piled these stones upon each other, and sometimes those stones toppled. That's the purpose of the flying buttresses. The flying buttresses would push inwards to keep those structures from falling. Now, also the idea of making your building taller than anybody else's, there was competition between the various cities and competition between the various cardinals of who could build their structure closer to God. Now, I realize that a few feet isn't going to physically get you closer, but the metaphor is that if you had the taller structure, you were closer to God than the other cardinals. And in the construction methods, the Roman barrel vault had to be improved upon because the strength of the vault focuses in a different way. By placing two barrel vaults in juxtaposition to each other, that gives you what's called a groin vault. And the groin vault will support upwards. Where you've got the stone on the round barrel vault, it's pushing downwards more. This will push upwards. Just like our middle sections, our groins, that holds up our torsos. So that's the concept behind that. In Beauvais Cathedral, the upper portion, or the ceiling, has these beautiful stained glass windows, again, telling all of the stories from the Bible that people would have recognized. Many of these were pilgrimage churches where pilgrims would go from their towns and show their faithfulness to God, to their faith, by taking these difficult, sometimes dangerous treks to these pilgrimage churches to show their faithfulness. And they would then look at the stained glass images and be reminded of the stories from the Bible. And here's looking straight up at these groin vaults. And actually, by adding in another rib, you'll hear the term a rib vault. So we go from a barrel vault to a groin vault, and then adding in even more strength. See, the groin vault would just have 4 ribs, and this has 6. And then we have a fan vault. So where in this rounded area, this would give us the strength for there. It is so tall that later on there were some stretchers put in to help support the sides of it. The area up here was built in 1500 to 1548, and a tragedy took place in 1573 where some of the parts of the cathedral had collapsed. So the stretchers had to be put in here. During the French Revolution, the revolutionaries decapitated the figures in the doorway. They didn't understand that these were saints, according to historians, but they thought that they were kings. So by taking down the statues, they thought that they were making their statement against kings, and these were actually many of the disciples. I don't know that whole story, but it's interesting to note that happened at Notre Dame as well. Interestingly enough, when they took over this cathedral, they dedicated it to reason. Interesting. Look at Sainte-Chapelle, or the Holy Chapel, and this again is in the Gothic style. On the Ile-de-Cité, where this is located, this was the residence of the kings of France until the 14th century. It was built in 7 years, which is a pretty impressive feat because some of these cathedrals would take 100 or more years to build. This was intended to house Christian relics, including the crown of thorns of Christ. And I brought in this image of this illustrated manuscript, one of the pages, because it's so interesting to look at as these were created at the time of how the things looked, of how the buildings looked, etc. So I wanted to bring in an illustrated manuscript image of it. So here is the acceptance of the crown of thorns by, there he is, King Louis the Ninth. And so this, of course, would make him an even more powerful king as he now had possession of these relics. And inside Sainte-Chapelle, there's that beautiful ceiling of the heavens with the stars. And that's one of the reasons I made that connection with the Egyptian ceilings to see how we depict the heavens. As you can see, a very tall chapel, and the stained glass, there are over 1,100 scenes of the stories from both the Old and the New Testaments. And here's looking up to those ceilings with the lights coming through the stained glass, and not only telling stories from the Old and New Testament, but also the stained glass is meant to represent the light of God coming into the interior. And here's a close-up of the painting and other decorative elements within the ribbed vaults, and gold leaf that has been put onto the ribs to make it even more glorious. And then some more of the stained glass. And even on the inside of this canopy mimics the ceiling of the cathedral. And then here's where the relics are kept in a reliquary. Now, a relic would be anywhere from the crown of thorns to a piece of Mary's robe to a piece of the true cross, a saint's bones, and the pilgrims would go to these various churches to worship, shall we say, to recognize these objects that would have come from the time of Christ. Now, the Sistine Chapel. This is always great fun to dissect a bit. And Michelangelo was not happy over being basically forced by the Pope to create the paintings in the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo was a sculptor, and he didn't really want to do the paintings, but he was being offered a carrot on a stick that if you complete this, we'll let you sculpt. If you complete this, we'll let you sculpt more for the church. And despite what we saw Kirk Douglas do in the movie, he did not lay on his back on a scaffold. He actually built the scaffolds himself. And here he is painting on the ceiling. This is one of his own little drawings. And in letters that he wrote to his father, he complained about craning his neck and how his neck and his shoulders hurt in creating the Sistine Chapel. Now, this was Pope Julius who took him away from sculpting and said, I need you to do the Sistine Chapel. And as we look up, there are various stories from the Bible. Here's Adam and Eve. Here's that famous image that I'll show you a close-up of that moment where God gives Adam life, and some other images that I'll be showing you. And here's the layout. Actually, it's kind of reversed from the image I just showed you. So here's where Adam and Eve are, and then God creates Adam. And here's that image where that zzz of life is given to this rather languid Adam figure. In this time frame of the Italian Renaissance, with the advent of humanism, that many of the artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo had studied the musculature system by going to the morgues and viewing the dissection of the bodies. And that humanism included scientific advances, and, to dissect a body may be unwanted in many religions. And so already both of them have run across the ire of the Catholic Church, but neither one of them really cared, especially Michelangelo. He was a little feistier than Da Vinci. And so in this image, it's been shown that the big cloak that encompasses God and who's thought to be Eve here is actually a cross section of a brain. And then over here, the scarf is the brain stem and all these pieces. So in this image where Michelangelo has not only shown his abilities in painting, but also there's many of these little hidden symbols within the Sistine Chapel. Here's the story of the deluge. And so here is individuals who are trying to protect themselves from the rain. And then over here, building the great ark as the animals are coming in. And then the Libyan Sibyl, who was a fortune teller, obviously is very masculine looking. Now, this is the fortune teller in classical mythology, foretold the coming of the day when that which is hidden shall be revealed. And at the time, Christians believed that she and other of the fortune tellers would have known of Christ's coming birth, is the inference here. And a couple things going on here. First of all, men would have been models. This is obviously a man's body. We have the images that he had drawn out to show his sketches. And what he would do basically was just plop a couple of tatas if a front version of a woman was shown. Some people have said it's because he was gay and hated women, but those two don't go together necessarily, and it wasn't really the important thing to think about in how he created these images. Rather, if other artists would have wanted to include a woman, they might have gone to the morgue to see an image of a woman. If you were a person, a woman who posed, you probably would have also been a prostitute. So wanting to avoid this sort of connection to that, we often do not see images from many of the artists of that time to connect to prostitutes. Rather, they would just take a male figure, a male nude, and then just kind of plop a couple of breasts on them. So it's interesting in going through these various images to see the type of culture at the time, that to have had a woman model would either have been a lady of the evening or would have been a corpse. All right. And then, of course, the Last Judgment, where it's thought to be the first time we see Christ without a beard. Interesting. And he's a rather buff Christ as well, casting individuals into hell or elevating them into heaven. Various saints have been depicted here. This is Saint Bartholomew. There he is right there. And he was martyred by being flayed alive. He was being skinned alive. And Michelangelo puts his own image, his own face, as a sort of self-portrait in the flayed skin of Saint Bartholomew. See how he holds a knife. There's also another image in the plate of where Judith slays Holofernes, that the plate that she holds the head on is also a self-portrait of Michelangelo. Now, here where he kind of mixes mythology with Christianity, this fellow is Charon, the boatman Charon, who ferries the damned across the river Styx into Hades. Almost like he's got this big oar that he's slapping people. It's like, let's move it along here. And then over here is King Minos. But King Minos has the face of the Pope's master of ceremony. His name was Biagio da Cesena. And Biagio da Cesena complained to the Pope of all of the nudity that was in the Last Judgment. Now, sections have been covered over. Now, the reason Michelangelo painted everybody nude, he surmised that when you die and go to heaven, that you're naked. But that bothered a lot of people's sensibility. So a later artist came in and painted these various scarves over the private parts. So Michelangelo was not happy about the master of ceremonies, Biagio da Cesena, complaining to the Pope. And so he paints King Minos with this snake biting upon his private parts and all of these individuals who are going down into hell, and with donkey ears. Now, I don't know why Charon also has donkey ears. For a long time, I thought that's who was being depicted, but upon further research, this is Biagio da Cesena. And when Biagio da Cesena complained to the Pope about Michelangelo's paintings, the Pope said, "Not my problem. I'm concerned only with heaven. Hell is not my purview." So therefore, the paintings stayed, and Michelangelo got his little poke at Biagio for complaining about him. Some more of these beautiful ceilings in Italy, the old palace. And here's some more of those beautiful coffers that the people in the Italian Renaissance who wanted to make connections with their Roman ancestors, kind of like we might want to see if we're descended from somebody from the Mayflower. The wealthy individuals, such as the Medici family, had sent archaeologists out to find these connections in sculptures and writings and whatever with their Roman senator ancestors. And so everything classical became important in the Renaissance era. And so hence we see a very elaborate version of those coffers, and this time in a six-sided section, a hexagon. And then, of course, all of the sides of the Palazzo Vecchio in the Old Palace are covered with various stories from history. Here's a close-up of that Hall of Justice ceiling with lots of gold leaf on it and various coats of arms. And here we are looking straight up at that ceiling. And then notice also the angels. This is a very religious time in the Renaissance. And then the Duke's Palace. Again, I want to show you the exterior so we know what's on the inside. And this is also built in a Gothic style. Note the pointed arches, which would represent praying hands. And inside the Duke's Palace in Mantua is a room that is not only the newlyweds chamber, but also a gathering place. So it's a huge structure, and there's little ante rooms, and then there's the bedroom itself. So this is a bedroom of which there are other rooms that go into it. So these are various members of the newlyweds family. And here is a declaration of their marriage being held aloft by angels. And then on the ceiling, and again, this is all done in fresco, is an oculus where various members of the family are looking down to the newlyweds, perhaps in a congratulatory way, perhaps in a way as we see the peacock there, who's also a symbol of fertility, as if the painter in creating this image, probably influenced by the parents of the newlyweds, are saying, let's get to it for the grandchildren. And then we have various putti, and the putti are the little fat Italian Renaissance angels. And so here this was done in sort of a trompe l'oeil. It looks realistic. You can see the foreshortening of this little angel, of the legs coming down. Now, foreshortening is a device used by artists where if I were to hold my hand up, that it's coming towards you, it would look extraordinarily large. So foreshortening is a way to show the extension of the legs without making it out of proportion. These may be various members of the family. We also have a Moor here. Now, Moors were not considered servants. These are people who are ambassadors and other important people. Here he is with his Moorish headdress. Again, as I had mentioned, that people went back and forth between Italy and Spain. In the Church of Saint Ignatius, Ignatius was the founder of the Jesuit community. An incredible ceiling in here. And this is also done in a type of trompe l'oeil, where looking upwards, it's an architectural kind of trompe l'oeil. I think you probably all know trompe l'oeil means fool the eye. So you're fooled into thinking that something is real. When you look upwards, that it looks as if that there's architecture going upwards when actually it's painting. I mean, this is just absolutely stunning. And so here is Saint Ignatius. Apotheosis is raising him up to a high status. All of these individuals flying upwards. And there he is as the leader of the Jesuits. Now, in the same church, Pozzo, the painter, also created a dome, but it's flat. It does not go upwards. It looks like it does. And actually, I've got an image here that's a little bit on the side. It actually looks straight up. But this is amazing what these artists could do. A palace that was created for Federico Gonzaga, again in Mantua. He hired the artist and architect Giulio Romano, and this is built in a very classical style, so Greco-Roman style. And on the inside is this incredible detail of the story of the conquering of the giants, a race of giants by Jupiter. And this is a fresco. Note also the beautiful marble tile floor. Now, Romano had been a student of Raphael. So he designed the building and also designed the murals, of which, of course, many of these artists don't do it by themselves. They have helpers for them. And here's all of these broken columns in the fight between the giants and Jupiter around the whole room. And so here's Jupiter coming in, mad as all heck, and he's going to keep these race of giants. They were quite aggressive, and they were known for their battle with the Olympian gods. And according to one of the writers of the time, the giants were the offspring of Gaia, who represented the earth, born from blood that fell when Uranus, representing the sky, was castrated by his son Cronus. There's a lot of bloody stuff going on in the various stories. So here are these various giants who are being conquered by Jupiter. And then here's the Olympian gods up here at the top. And then goes all the way up to the ceiling where there's this big sort of shell figure and all of these various Olympian gods surrounded by the clouds. And even right here, you can see a zephyr. A zephyr is a wind-blowing god. Here's another zephyr where they're blowing, just like the instrument, the zephyr. And here's another image. Here again, these giants are trying to destroy this area. Now, moving on into the German Rococo era. So what I was just showing you is part of the Italian Renaissance era. In Sanssouci, which means without worry, this was one of the palaces of Frederick the Great. And it's surprisingly light and Rococo. Now, Rococo is the period of Louis the 15th, where all of the foliage is very asymmetrical and very pretty. And this would influence other countries as well. And on the interiors and the ceilings, this is so very asymmetrical Rococo style. And where this comes from is in the previous king in France, Louis the 14th, everything was very heavy, very symmetrical. And so in the period of Louis the 15th, who came to the throne in 1723, everything lightened up quite a bit. And the very light-hearted designs and asymmetrical leaves and shells, that's where the term Rococo comes from, is rocaille, which is a ruffled edge of a shell. That the ceiling, and in this particular case is the music room, there's all of these gilded plaster, gold leaf over plaster. Actually, you've got to put a glue down first. So the plaster, then a glue called bole, B-O-L-E, and then the gold leaf. Now, the mirror surroundings, those are actually gilt bronze mounts. So this is bronze carving underneath sculpture that then has a gilding process put on it. Very poisonous process. It's actually mercury mixed with gold and then heated. But on the ceiling and on along the walls, that is gilded plaster. In another one of the German interiors of the Rococo style, even though the exterior is more classical. Augustusburg has some beautiful details, not only on the walls, but in the ceiling. Saint John Nepomuk is the patron saint of Bohemia, and the ceiling is one of the stories of Saint John of Nepomuk. Many of these ceilings would either be of the Baroque style, where there's a lot of drama and movement, or of a Rococo style, which has more of the little angels and the little putti flying around. This one is almost looking a bit more heavier Baroque, but nevertheless, amazing ceiling. And in Augustusburg, the dining room, the Rococo plaster goes all the way into the ceiling. And here's another view of it. This is a little bit darker than it really is, but I had this particular photo. And then here's in the dining room where various place settings are shown. And the colors of Rococo are generally pastels. Going to Michaelsburg Abbey, this is what I've really been waiting to get to because the ceiling is so interesting. So first of all, we're going to walk down a beautiful corridor where the groin vault sort of ceiling is decorated with beautiful little leaves and flowers and various meanings, again, coming from the Bible. Here's some close-ups referencing agriculture. Look at these beautiful paintings, the appreciation of the irises and the little buttercups. And most of these will have various meanings in Christianity. There's a painting, the Madonna of the Irises, for example. But in the Holy Grave Chapel, of which there's these rather heavy German carvings, the ceiling is filled with these images of death and various meanings of death, because this is the Holy Grave Chapel to recognize those who have passed on. And they have to do with the fleetingness of life and understanding that time goes quickly. So this is probably the most famous one of the plaster works of death blowing bubbles. And here the skeleton is holding an hourglass, all very beautiful in this Rococo style. And then up here are various images of important people at this time that death is hanging over them, as well, it will happen for all of us. And this one in kind of a contemplative mood. And they're all around this kind of octagonal ceiling of just these various reminders. Here we are writing the diary of life, and almost like when you get to St. Peter, opening up the book and seeing if your deeds were good. And here is where the skeleton is holding a vase. And the docent said that the connotation was that this is the vase of your ashes. So you can kind of see the little poof of ashes coming out of the vase here. And then here is a skeleton with the Grim Reaper pulling this individual along, probably into the kingdom of heaven here. And here's the skeleton with the vase of ashes. And then here's the shell shape, the rocaille. Really fascinating place. Oh, here's a couple more. There's a close-up probably Saint Michael, who's being pulled along by the skeleton. And here you can see the skeleton is running, trying to go after the young child, and the young child is not having this. And the young child is surrounded by agriculture. So the early stages of life of the wheat and the pumpkins here. So the whole story being told. Oh, this one, absolutely fabulous. In Tuscany, there is the Samazzano Castle. And this is one of the castles that has a lot of Moorish design to it. So this was built for Umberto the First and filled with these beautiful tiles and mosaics and just this burst of rainbow colors that are on the inside. So it's been called a mix of Moorish with Byzantine. And then also it's been related to Indian design from India and Chinese design as well. And this used all local craftsmen. And look at this. I mean, just the colors in this. So some of it is painted, some of it is tiled. And this is a time, when you look back here, of an interest in travel as the railroads allowed us to travel more extensively, and especially Western Europeans and Americans were interested in other non-Western locales. So people would travel to the Middle East, they traveled to Spain and see Moorish design. They would travel to the areas that we now know as Syria and the Holy Land and incorporate non-Western design into many of their interiors. This is why Victorian houses are so cluttered, is we love a good Victorian, but it was to showcase all of the items that you had picked up along your travels. And as we round the corner, here is the beautiful little chapel in England. And this was one of the big surprises of my travels. I hadn't known about this until I went on an arts and crafts tour with the Gamble House, which is in Pasadena. And this was created by a woman, Mary Watts, whose husband was a well-known painter of the time. And she saw that the townspeople in Compton, in Surrey, in England at the time of the arts and crafts era, needed to learn a craft. At this time in England, they were experiencing the problems of the Industrial Revolution. This was putting a lot of people out of work in Europe that has a tradition of handcraftedness. So she created a workshop where everybody, all ages, could learn how to do drawing and sewing and especially tile craft. So on the interior of the Watts Cemetery Chapel, very small little area, you might be able to fit 20 people in here, a little bit crowded. And on the walls are these beautiful paintings and tile. So a lot of it is actually terracotta underneath these paintings. It was such a surprise when I saw this because it's out in an area that's very not rural, but off the beaten path. And so all of this terracotta relief, in other words, it kind of bumps up a little bit carving, was done by the townspeople. And she dedicated it to the loving memory of all who find rest near its walls, and for the comfort and help of those to whom the sorrow of separation remains. And all of the beautiful little children's faces are incorporated in these kinds of blooming flowers. And then various saints are depicted. 74 of the local townspeople, including the children, created this. So she trained them in clay modeling And that has eventually led to the establishment of the Compton Potters Guild in 1899. And then here again are some of the angels. And when we look at images of angels, they are generally sexless. So you have cherubim and seraphim layers of angels, and they usually have this big cloak of wings around them. And then here looking up at the transept are more of these little angel faces. And so it was paid for by her husband, who again was a well-known painter at the time. And there's also a cemetery there of which Mary and her husband George Watts are buried. Sagrada Familia of Antoni Gaudí, his final project, and it's still unfinished, as sadly he had been run over by a bus, a tram, when he was working at the site. And so it's made out of a type of stone called Montjuic stone. And that translates as Jewish mountain. It's one of the quarries around Barcelona. And every one of these individuals are real people that he had his sculptors create, and he did so as well. And there's a great story about one of the little donkeys that he had put out the call for the donkey that would carry Mary and Joseph, and everybody brought him the finest donkeys in all of the land. But he said that the donkey that would have carried Mary and Joseph would not have been a big, strong donkey. It would have been probably a little broken down donkey. And so finally, he found the donkey he wanted in an old woman who was selling scouring sand, kind of like Ajax or Comet. And so he put the plaster casts over the poor donkey, and the woman cried out that, "What's going to happen to my donkey?" I'm sure the donkey wasn't too happy about it either. So, in another one of the portals where the donkey is carrying Mary, that is taken from an actual donkey. On the interior, in a Gothic like style, although this is Art Nouveau, as Antoni Gaudí would be of the Art Nouveau period in Spain of the turn of the century. But he pulls upon Gothic imagery, and looking straight up, we see all of these columns reaching towards the ceiling. Some of them look like bones. Well, the patron saint of Barcelona, the state of Catalonia, is Saint George, and Saint George slays the dragon being a metaphor for the devil. And so he often uses this symbolism of the bones of the dragon that has been slayed as a reminder of that story of Saint George slaying the dragon. And then lastly, let's take a look at where I'm going to propose to Michelle to do a part 2 of this, not to put you on any sort of pressure or anything, because I've got to put it all together, of going into secular structures, since we have primarily looked at religious structures and a few others. And the interior of Grand Central Terminal has the ceiling that at first looks like the astrological signs, but there's more of a story behind this. This is a beautiful old image where all of the light is coming in. We nearly lost this, like Penn Station, but Jacqueline Kennedy stepped in and made sure that this was preserved. And so on the ceiling, showing the astrological symbols, Paul Eluard had seen an image of a manuscript, and I wish I could find that specific image. But in creating the ceiling, when you look up at the astrological signs, the manuscript that he saw, a manuscript from the Middle Ages, described an image of the heavens where God was actually looking down. See, we tend to think of the heavens as we're looking up, but God looking down. As one of my design students at UCLA explained, it's like a reversed ceiling plan. So, as if you were to take the heavens now and turn them over and look down upon them as if God were looking down upon them. Now, I'm not quite sure how to figure that out because that is a little bit of a mind bender, but that's what Paul Eluh, the artist, was doing in the ceiling of Grand Central. So that brings us to just a few of the many, many, many beautiful ceilings throughout the world. And I so appreciate your being here today, Michelle. Thank you for watching over us. And I look forward to seeing all of you again very soon.